May the words of my mouth and the thoughts of our hearts be accepted in your sight, O Lord, our comforter and our disturber. Amen. What kind of books do you like, Lynn? What kind of films do you like? I like books and films with a good story about people. Well, we've got a good story this morning. The next part 2 of the Jacob and Esau story that we are doing over the next few weeks. Here again in Genesis, in this story today, with Rebekah and Isaac and Jacob and Esau. This is the second time we hear of Esau being done out of one of his rights. He was done out of his birthright, and now he's been done out of the blessing of his father at this end of his father's life. So, a good story with characters with depth. That's what we get in the Old Testament. We get a good story with characters and depth. This story from the Old Testament is not just about Jacob and Esau, because really in this chapter we see Isaac and Rebekah. Rebekah, who has favouritism over her sons. Jacob was Rebekah's favourite, and Esau was Isaac's favourite. Favouritism is not a good thing. Many of us may have experienced, or know families experienced it. And it can make people feel they're never good enough. Whatever they do, they never get the praise that they long for or the acceptance they long for. So here we have Rebekah telling her son Jacob, look, your father's maybe about to die. You need to get his blessing. And so she helps and encourages Jacob to deceive Isaac, to get his blessing at his deathbed. Isaac and Rebekah, they stand for something about favouritism. Here we see Jacob and Esau once more in conflict. This story has a lot of conflict and a lot of characters with depth. That's the great thing about the Old Testament. There is, especially in the book of Genesis, and we'll see that again later on when we continue the Jacob story, and later on in the book of Genesis, of course, is the Joseph story, and we see there again characters with depth. So we hear Jacob being encouraged and enabled to get his father's blessing at his father's deathbed, to deceive him, because it was in that time, of course, it was the right of the eldest son, which was Esau, to get the birthright. What do we think about this story? What maybe it makes us think, where's God in all this? Well, we'll think about that as we go on. Where is God in this? Here we have a deathbed scene. Now, many deathbed scenes are not often about reconciling. You can often see that on the television or read it in books, but as a part-time chaplain for many years, I saw a different side of deathbed scenes. And I remember one of the charge nurses said it to me, we need to be like the United Nations, keeping families apart or trying to hold it all together for families. So the deathbed scene is there in this story as well. Jacob and Esau. Here again, Jacob is doing his brother out of his right as the eldest son. But the amazing thing about this story is at the end of it, Jacob doesn't really, he may deceive his father and get the blessing, but then we're told that he has to go and he has to leave his mother behind, and he has to go away and not come back to where he belongs. And all through Jacob's story, which we'll continue to see, is that Jacob is always having to look back to make sure he's always frightened that something's happening behind him and somebody's going to get him. He's never able to leave the past behind. This story is a story about conflict and drama, and you can imagine it on a play where the audience know things that some of the main characters don't know. Like Esau won't have known what Jacob was doing, but the audience would. During lockdown, I watched a wonderful series, and there's been 3 series of this programme called The A Word. And it centres around a young boy who has autism, Joe, and his family, his mum and his dad, and then his older sister, and his grandfather, who has lost his wife and is falling in love with someone else, who has a son who has Down syndrome. And the grandfather is played by Christopher Eccleston, who also has a son who runs a family business and wants to sell it. Over the 8 weeks that I watched that programme, it was all about characters with depth, a bit like the story of Genesis. If you were wanting a programme that ticked all the boxes and everybody fitted into our expectations of family, then that wasn't the programme for you. Because it was actually, if you were looking in, you'd think it'd be a bit of a dysfunctional family, a bit like the story of Jacob and Esau. But the honesty in that programme and the integrity of the characters was beautiful. A young boy who has Down syndrome falls in love with a young girl who has Down syndrome. And they want to get married. And they do get married with the consent and help of both sets of parents. And it's the most tender and beautiful love scene. It's honest and it's just beautiful. And as I say, all the characters in it have depth. If you're looking for something, I would recommend The A Word. It's still on BBC iPlayer. It's certainly a good story, just like this is a good story of Jacob and Esau. Jacob and Esau go on, and we will follow the story again next week. But today what we're thinking about is Jacob and how he has to leave things behind, how he has to go because of what he's done to his brother Esau. And he lives in fear of his brother Esau, and we see that later on. Maybe you're asking, where is God in all this? Where is God in all this? Well, in the Daily Study Bible, the Willie Bartley series, this is what one of the commentators, Professor Gibson, says about God. He said, this horrendous story is not inviting us to criticise God, but to look in a mirror and see ourselves. Maybe we see ourselves in Jacob or Esau or Isaac or Rebecca. And this story is inviting us not to criticise God, but to look in a mirror and see ourselves. Sometimes when we read a story or a book, we identify with the characters. God is in all of this human mess, this amazing different kind of relationships and deceit and everything. God's in the midst of all of that, just like God's in the midst of our lives, holding it all together, holding us together. Amen, and to God be the glory in the church and the world.